A wealthy businessman invited his driver to a lavish party with the intention of humiliating him. But when the driver arrived and introduced himself, the guests stood up and started applauding. The grand mansion stood illuminated against the dark night, a beacon of wealth and power. Inside, the city's elite gathered for an exclusive party hosted by a businessman notorious for his arrogance. Among the guests, there was a name that stood out, not because of prestige, but because of its simplicity: his chauffeur. This man, humble and reserved, had been in the businessman's service for years. The invitation came unexpectedly, leaving the chauffeur both curious and suspicious. Why would someone of his status be invited to such a luxurious event? Little did he know, this night would change everything. The chauffeur pondered the invitation for days, torn between attending and declining. He knew his place in society, and this invitation felt out of character for his employer. The businessman, who hardly acknowledged him beyond work, had never shown interest in him personally. Was it a gesture of goodwill or something more sinister? Despite his reservations, he couldn't shake the curiosity gnawing at him. What harm could come from attending? With a deep breath, he made his decision. He would go. What awaited him, however, was far beyond what he could imagine. Behind the scenes, the businessman reveled in his plan. His intention was far from noble. He sought to humiliate the chauffeur in front of the influential guests. To him, the chauffeur was nothing more than a servant, undeserving of respect or attention. The idea of parading him in front of the city's elite, only to watch him squirm under the spotlight, gave the businessman a twisted sense of pleasure. He imagined the laughter, the whispers of mockery, and the chauffeur's embarrassment. His trap was set, and he was certain it would play out perfectly. But life has a way of unraveling even the most meticulous plans. The night of the party arrived, and the mansion glowed with opulence. Guests arrived in lavish cars, draped in luxury from head to toe. Inside, the atmosphere was buzzing with excitement, but there was also an undercurrent of curiosity. The chauffeur's name on the guest list had sparked confusion among the attendees. Whispers circulated, questioning why a man of such humble status would be invited to an event reserved for the elite. The businessman, overhearing these whispers, could barely contain his smug grin. Everything was going as planned, or so he thought. As the chauffeur arrived at the mansion, he was immediately aware of the stark contrast between himself and the other guests. He wore a simple suit, clean but modest, while everyone around him dripped in wealth. The stares were immediate. Some were curious, others disdainful. The silence that followed his entrance was deafening, but the chauffeur, with steady composure, walked in with his head held high. He had no illusions about how out of place he seemed, but he had come to face whatever was ahead. His calm demeanor only added to the intrigue, and the guests couldn't help but watch his every move. The businessman observed from a distance, his eyes fixed on the chauffeur. The subtle smirk on his face was a testament to his confidence. He believed that the chauffeur, now surrounded by a world he didn't belong to, would soon falter. But as the moments passed, the businessman started to notice something unsettling. The chauffeur wasn't flustered. In fact, he seemed almost at ease, walking through the crowd with a quiet grace that didn't fit the narrative the businessman had imagined. The seeds of doubt began to plant themselves in the businessman's mind, though he tried to push them aside. As the night progressed, the mood in the room began to shift. At first, the chauffeur was the subject of quiet gossip, but soon, something changed. The guests, who had initially judged him for his appearance, were now paying closer attention to his demeanor. There was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet strength that commanded respect. The whispers turned from mockery to curiosity, and slowly, the energy in the room became more complex. The businessman, still oblivious to this change, continued to entertain his guests, confident that the night's climax would bring the humiliation he so desired. However, the chauffeur remained unaware of the growing interest in him. For him, the night was about surviving the discomfort and returning to his life unnoticed. but it became harder to ignore the shifting atmosphere. He could feel the eyes on him, but they weren't hostile. There was something different, something he hadn't anticipated. The initial discomfort he felt upon entering the mansion started to fade, replaced by a strange sense of calm. He couldn't quite understand it yet, but something significant was unfolding around him. As the tension in the room built, the businessman moved closer to his chauffeur, eager to initiate the final stage of his plan. He imagined that the guests would soon erupt in laughter, mocking the man who didn't belong. But as he approached, the businessman noticed the subtle shift in the way the guests were looking at his chauffeur. There were no smirks or sneers. There was admiration. The businessman's confidence wavered for the first time that night. He had misjudged something, but what exactly had gone wrong? The answer was close, but still just beyond his reach. By the time the businessman reached his chauffeur, the atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The murmurs had grown louder, but they weren't filled with contempt. Instead, they were laced with respect. It was as if, in the space of a few hours, the chauffeur had somehow won the room over. The businessman's plan to humiliate him had backfired in ways he couldn't have predicted. And as he stood there, watching the scene unfold, a strange mix of emotions took hold: confusion, frustration, and an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. The night was no longer in his control. The day of the grand event arrived, and the mansion gleamed under the setting sun, radiating luxury and grandeur. The chauffeur, dressed in his modest suit, stepped out of his small car, a stark contrast to the luxurious vehicles parked around him. The guests, adorned in expensive gowns and tailored suits, whispered among themselves as he made his way toward the entrance. His presence stirred confusion, as it was clear he didn't belong in this world of opulence. Still, he walked with quiet confidence, unaware that his every move was being scrutinized. The businessman watched from afar, his smile smug with anticipation. As the chauffeur entered the mansion, the atmosphere became thick with tension. The lavish decorations, crystal chandeliers, and gold accents created an environment that screamed exclusivity. The crowd parted slightly as he made his way inside, their gazes following his every step. It was clear that his presence was unexpected, and whispers of confusion filled the air. The businessman, watching from across the room, could hardly contain his satisfaction. He believed the humiliation would begin as soon as the chauffeur felt the weight of the stairs and the judgment that followed him like a shadow. However, the chauffeur maintained his composure, despite the growing discomfort around him. He stood quietly in the corner, observing the glittering spectacle before him. The opulence was overwhelming, but he didn't let it intimidate him. His humble attire contrasted sharply with the extravagance around him, yet he wasn't ashamed. He was there for a reason, though he still couldn't fully grasp what it was. The whispers of the guests began to grow louder, but instead of shrinking away, he stood firm, allowing their eyes to wander. He would not be broken so easily. The businessman, surrounded by his influential guests, couldn't help but steal glances at his chauffeur. Everything was unfolding exactly as he had imagined. The guests were puzzled by the man's presence, their confusion growing with each passing minute. They questioned each other. Who was he, and why was he here? Yet, despite the murmurs, the chauffeur did not falter. The businessman's smirk widened, believing it was only a matter of time before the night took the turn he had planned. The tension was building, and he waited for the moment of collapse. The guest's curiosity, however, began to shift from disdain to fascination. The chauffeur's calm demeanor in the face of such an extravagant setting was intriguing. He didn't seem overwhelmed or out of place, despite the contrast between himself and the other guests. It was as though he belonged there in a way none of them could understand. This subtle change in the room's energy was not lost on some of the more observant attendees. They began to wonder if there was more to this man than met the eye, though they couldn't yet articulate what that might be. As the night progressed, the chauffeur began to feel the weight of the businessman's plan. He noticed the lingering stares, the hushed whispers that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But instead of caving under the pressure, he found an inner strength. His years of humility and hard work had prepared him for moments like these. He stood with quiet dignity, refusing to let the judgments of the room define him. His posture never faltered, and his eyes remained steady, surveying the room with calm detachment. He had faced far worse in life than this, and he would not let this night undo him. The businessman, however, was growing impatient. He expected the chauffeur to crumble under the pressure by now. His plan was supposed to be flawless, but something wasn't going according to script. The guests weren't ridiculing the chauffeur the way he had envisioned. Instead, some were beginning to show signs of respect, though subtle. The businessman couldn't understand why his carefully laid plan wasn't unfolding as intended. Frustration began to build within him, but he continued to watch, hoping for the humiliation he believed was still to come. The guests, meanwhile, began to form their own opinions. Some still viewed the chauffeur as an oddity, a man out of place in such a glamorous setting. But others were starting to see something more. A quiet strength, a sense of calm that none of them possessed. He wasn't seeking attention, yet he commanded it effortlessly. It was a rare quality in a room full of people desperate to be seen. Slowly, the mood in the room began to shift, as more and more guests noticed the incongruity between the chauffeur's humble appearance and the respect he seemed to naturally attract. As the night wore on, the chauffeur found himself in conversations he hadn't expected. A few brave guests approached him, curious to know more about the man who had been invited to such an exclusive event. Their questions were probing, but the chauffeur answered with humility and grace, never revealing more than necessary. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, but his quiet wisdom spoke volumes. His calm responses only deepened the guests' intrigue, and before long, word spread about his unexpected composure. The businessman watched this unfold with growing unease. By the end of the night, the tension in the room had reached its peak. The chauffeur, once the subject of gossip and judgment, had become the center of attention in a way no one could have predicted. The businessman's plan was unraveling before his eyes, and he couldn't stop it. The guests were no longer mocking the chauffeur. They were admiring him. The businessman, feeling the weight of his own arrogance, struggled to maintain his composure. What was supposed to be a night of humiliation had turned into something entirely different, and the businessman was left wondering how he had lost control of the narrative so quickly. As the chauffeur made his way through the crowd, the air in the room thickened with anticipation. The guests, who had initially dismissed him as an oddity, now felt compelled to engage with him. His calm demeanor and unassuming presence commanded attention in a way none of them expected. When the businessman finally introduced him to the crowd, there was a moment of silence, as if the room held its breath. Then, something no one had anticipated occurred. A round of applause broke out, slowly at first, but then it grew louder, filling the grand hall with unexpected admiration. The businessman's smirk faltered as the applause reverberated through the room. This wasn't part of the plan. He had expected laughter, perhaps even outright mockery, but what he got instead was a standing ovation. The guests, far from belittling the chauffeur, were acknowledging him with respect. It was as though the mere presence of the man, so different from the lavish world around him, struck a chord with everyone in attendance. Confusion washed over the businessman as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. His carefully constructed narrative was unraveling before his eyes. As the applause continued, some of the more influential guests approached the chauffeur, their eyes filled with curiosity. They began to ask him questions, not out of ridicule, but out of genuine interest. Who was he, really? How did he manage to carry himself with such poise in a setting that should have overwhelmed him? With every answer, the chauffeur revealed little of himself, yet somehow, his humble responses only deepened the admiration. The businessman watched helplessly, his sense of control slipping away as the room seemed to turn against him, not in hostility, but in reverence for the very man he intended to humiliate. The guest's fascination with the chauffeur grew, leaving the businessman increasingly isolated in his own event. His once loyal circle of influential friends now drifted towards the chauffeur, eager to learn more about the mysterious man who had captured their attention. Every compliment directed toward the chauffeur felt like a personal insult to the businessman, whose ego could not fathom the shift in dynamics. The night was no longer his to control. It was becoming a celebration of the man he had thought beneath him, a man who now stood in the spotlight, not as a subject of ridicule, but as the unexpected hero of the evening. The chauffeur, meanwhile, remained calm amidst the growing admiration. He had not come to seek validation, yet here he was, receiving more respect than he had ever imagined. There was a serenity in his gaze, as if he had anticipated this turn of events long before the night began. The businessman, watching him from the corner of the room, felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, and, for the first time, fear. What had he missed? How had this man, so seemingly ordinary, turned the night in his favor with such ease? As the night wore on, the guests couldn't help but compare the businessman's arrogance to the chauffeur's humility. What started as a plan to humiliate the chauffeur had now flipped entirely. The businessman's ego, once the dominant force in the room, was shrinking in the face of the chauffeur's quiet dignity. The guests' respect for the chauffeur only deepened as they realized how starkly different the two men were. One consumed by pride, the other grounded in integrity. It was a stark contrast that no one had anticipated, least of all the businessman himself. For the businessman, the evening had become a nightmare. His attempts to regain control of the situation were futile. Every move he made only seemed to reinforce the chauffeur's quiet strength. The more he tried to insert himself into the conversation, the more awkward and forced his presence felt. He could feel the power dynamic shifting, and it terrified him. The guests, once his loyal admirers, were now drawn to the man he had considered beneath them all. It was as though the very fabric of his social standing was unraveling before him. The chauffeur's quiet victory wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about integrity. He hadn't sought to humiliate the businessman in return. In fact, he hadn't even tried to assert himself in the situation. It was his authenticity that had won over the room, something the businessman could never have anticipated. The applause, the admiration, the respect, it all came naturally, without effort or pretense. The businessman, for all his wealth and influence, was left scrambling for a way to salvage his own reputation, which now seemed precariously close to collapse. As the night drew closer to its peak, the guests began to speak in hushed tones, their curiosity about the chauffeur now turning into open admiration. The businessman, still clinging to the remnants of his plan, was forced to face the uncomfortable truth. He had severely underestimated the man who had served him for years. The chauffeur, without saying much, had become the most respected figure in the room, while the businessman's arrogance had only served to highlight his own shortcomings. The night was slipping away from him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. By the time the evening was nearing its end, the mood in the room had completely shifted. The chauffeur had gone from an unexpected guest to the heart of the event. Guests who had once looked down on him were now in awe, their admiration palpable. The businessman, standing on the sidelines, could only watch as his plan fell apart. What was meant to be a night of humiliation for the chauffeur had turned into a night of revelation for everyone else. The businessman's grip on his own world was loosening, and the night wasn't over yet. The room fell silent as one of the most influential guests stepped forward, his eyes locked on the chauffeur. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with curiosity and the weight of unspoken truths. He cleared his throat, commanding the attention of everyone present, and then, with a voice filled with awe, began to reveal something no one had expected. The man standing before them wasn't just a chauffeur. He had once been a prominent figure, a leader, a man of extraordinary deeds. The guests, stunned, exchanged glances as they tried to comprehend this sudden revelation. The businessman, frozen in place, could barely believe what he was hearing. This man, his chauffeur, had been someone of immense importance. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room, leaving the businessman reeling. He had always thought of his chauffeur as a simple man, unworthy of attention, someone who faded into the background. But now, the truth was spilling out in front of everyone, and it painted a picture that shattered every assumption he had held. The man he had tried to humiliate was not only respected but revered for his past. As the influential guest continued, the story unfolded like a legend. Years ago, before the chauffeur had taken up his modest profession, he had been a beacon of hope in the community, known for his acts of selflessness and courage. When times were difficult, he had been the one to step forward, offering his resources, his strength, and his heart to those in need. His life had been marked by kindness and bravery, earning him the admiration of many. But then, tragedy struck. A personal loss had driven him to retreat from public life, choosing a quieter, simpler existence. The guests were mesmerized by the tale. Every word deepened their respect for the chauffeur, who stood quietly, listening as his past was laid bare. He had never sought recognition for the things he had done, nor had he ever spoken of them. His humility had kept him from revealing the greatness that had once defined him. But now, in the glow of the chandeliers and under the gaze of the city's elite, the truth could no longer be hidden. It wasn't just admiration they felt now, it was awe. The man they had dismissed at first glance had lived a life far richer than they could have imagined. The businessman's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of his mistake crashed down on him. He had tried to ridicule a man who had once stood as a pillar of the community, a man who had lived through more pain and sacrifice than he could ever comprehend. The shame was overwhelming, a burning embarrassment that he couldn't escape. Every guest in the room now looked at the chauffeur with a reverence that had once been reserved for him, and the businessman felt his status slip away. He had grossly misjudged the very person who had served him faithfully for years. As the story continued, the businessman found it harder to breathe. He realized that the chauffeur had never boasted about his past, never sought to elevate himself in the eyes of others. His humility wasn't a facade. It was genuine, born out of a desire to live a life of peace after years of hardship. The businessman, who had spent his life flaunting his wealth and power, felt a deep sense of inadequacy in comparison. The room had shifted, and all eyes were on the chauffeur, not out of pity or confusion, but out of admiration for the man he truly was. The chauffeur, for his part, remained silent throughout the revelation. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't expected his past to be laid bare in such a public way. But as the words filled the room, he stood tall, his quiet dignity unwavering. There was no pride in his expression, no need for validation. He had lived his life with integrity, and that was enough for him. Yet, the respect that filled the air was undeniable. The guests, who had once looked at him with disdain, now saw him for who he truly was, a man of character, shaped by both triumph and tragedy. For the guests, the revelation was transformative. The room that had once buzzed with shallow conversations about wealth and status was now alive with a deeper sense of reflection. The chauffeur's story had touched something within them, a reminder that true greatness doesn't always come in the form of riches or power. Many of them began to question their own lives, their own values, wondering if they had ever shown the kind of humility and strength that the chauffeur had demonstrated. It was a humbling moment, and it left an indelible mark on everyone present. As the applause began to rise once more, this time louder and more heartfelt, the businessman could no longer hide his discomfort. His plan had failed spectacularly, and in its place, a new truth had emerged, one that he couldn't control or deny. The chauffeur, the man he had tried to belittle, had become the hero of the evening, and there was nothing the businessman could do to change that. The applause wasn't just for the man's past deeds. It was for the quiet dignity with which he carried himself, even in the face of such public scrutiny. The night was no longer about wealth or status. It was about character, integrity, and the quiet strength that can transform even the most humble of lives into something extraordinary. The guests had come expecting a night of luxury, but they were leaving with something far more valuable, a lesson in humility. And as the businessman stood in the shadows, watching the admiration for the chauffeur grow, he knew that the night was far from over. The next chapter would demand something from him that he wasn't sure he was ready to give, an admission of his own failings. The businessman stood in the shadows, watching the admiration for the chauffeur grow with every passing moment. His heart raced, his mind spinning with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite control. What started as a carefully crafted plan to humiliate the man who had served him for years had turned into something else entirely. The guests, who once hung on his every word, now gravitated toward the chauffeur, showering him with respect that the businessman craved. The weight of his mistake bore down on him, suffocating his pride. For the first time in years, he felt small, insignificant. The room, once filled with laughter and shallow conversations about wealth, had shifted. The focus was no longer on the businessman's grandiose displays of luxury, but on the quiet dignity of the chauffeur. The businessman's ego was bruised, but more than that, he was confronted by a realization that made his chest tighten with guilt. He had wronged the man who had stood by his side, not just as a servant but as a human being. His arrogance had blinded him to the truth, and now he was paying the price. But the question that haunted him was simple. Could he make it right? As the guests continued to gather around the chauffeur, the businessman's inner turmoil grew. His mind raced with conflicting emotions: anger, shame, and a deep sense of loss. His pride told him to walk away, to pretend that none of this mattered. But another voice, quieter yet more insistent, urged him to face the truth. This was his chance to change, to confront the man he had wronged and admit his failures. The thought terrified him. He had built his entire life on the foundation of power and control, and now, for the first time, he was being asked to let go of both. The chauffeur, for his part, remained calm, as if sensing the businessman's struggle from across the room. He had no desire for revenge, no wish to see the businessman humiliated. His presence was a reminder of something much deeper: humanity, humility, and the strength that comes from acknowledging one's flaws. The guests may have been enamored by the revelation of his past, but the chauffeur carried none of that with him. He had lived through hardship, and he had learned to find peace in the quiet moments. His offer to the businessman, though unspoken, was clear. This was a moment for redemption. The businessman, however, wasn't ready to embrace that truth. His mind clung to the last remnants of his pride, refusing to let go of the power he had wielded for so long. But with every passing minute, the walls he had built around himself were crumbling. The respect he once commanded had shifted, and he knew it. He could feel the eyes of the guests on him, watching, waiting to see how he would respond. His every instinct screamed at him to leave, to retreat into the safety of his wealth and status. But something else, something deeper, kept him rooted to the spot. As the tension in the room thickened, the businessman took a hesitant step toward the chauffeur. The distance between them felt immense, not because of the physical space, but because of the emotional chasm that had opened up between them. The businessman's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the man he had wronged, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't sure what he would say, or even if he could find the words. But the closer he got, the clearer it became. This was his moment. A moment to confront his own arrogance and make amends, if he had the courage to do so. The guests, sensing the shift, watched in silence as the businessman approached the chauffeur. There was no judgment in their eyes, only curiosity. They had seen the businessman in all his glory, and now they were witnessing something far more significant, a moment of vulnerability. The room, once buzzing with chatter, had fallen still, as if everyone held their breath. The businessman, now face to face with the man he had tried to humiliate, felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. His mind screamed for him to walk away, to preserve what little dignity he had left. But his heart, in that rare moment of clarity, told him to stay. The chauffeur looked at the businessman with calm, unwavering eyes. There was no anger there, no resentment, only a quiet understanding. The businessman opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His pride, still clinging to him like a shadow, fought against the admission he knew he had to make. But he couldn't escape the truth. He had wronged this man, and no amount of wealth or power could change that. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him, and finally spoke the words he had feared for so long: "I was wrong." The room seemed to exhale all at once as the businessman's confession hung in the air. The guests, who had expected arrogance or excuses, were stunned by his admission. But the most surprising reaction came from the chauffeur himself. He didn't gloat, didn't revel in the businessman's discomfort. Instead, he offered a small, understanding nod. It was a gesture of forgiveness, though no words were spoken. In that simple nod, the businessman saw the path forward. He had been given a chance, not just to make amends, but to change. And now, It was up to him to decide if he would take it. The businessman, still shaken by his own vulnerability, felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. The weight of his pride, the need to control everything, had been lifted, if only for a moment. He looked at the chauffeur, the man he had once thought so far beneath him, and saw him for who he truly was, a man of strength, integrity, and humility. The businessman realized that this confrontation wasn't about humiliation or power. It was about redemption, and as the room began to stir once more, he knew that the hardest decision still lay ahead. The air in the room was thick with tension as the businessman stood face to face with the chauffeur. It was a moment that felt suspended in time, the weight of it pressing down on everyone present. All eyes were on them, waiting to see what would happen next. The businessman, whose world had been built on arrogance and pride, was now standing at a crossroads. This was the moment that would define him, not just in the eyes of the guests, but in his own. The chauffeur, with his quiet dignity, had extended an unspoken offer. Redemption was within reach, but only if the businessman had the courage to seize it. The businessman's mind raced, torn between the familiar comfort of his pride and the unsettling vulnerability of humility. His entire life had been a performance, a show of strength and control. To admit weakness, especially in front of those who had once looked up to him, felt impossible. Yet, there was something undeniable in the air, something that told him this moment was different. This wasn't just about saving face or maintaining his status. It was about something deeper, something that had been missing from his life for far too long. He could feel it in his chest, an ache he hadn't known existed until now. The guests, sensing the gravity of the situation, remained silent, their gazes shifting between the two men. The businessman, for the first time in his life, felt exposed, not by wealth or power, but by his own humanity. He had spent years building walls around himself, hiding behind luxury and influence, but now those walls were crumbling. He looked into the chauffeur's eyes and saw no judgment, only a quiet understanding. The decision was his alone. No one could force him to change, but the opportunity was there, hanging in the balance, waiting for him to make his choice. As the seconds ticked by, the businessman felt the weight of his life's choices pressing down on him. He had spent years trying to prove his worth through material success, but now, in this moment of truth, none of it mattered. What mattered was the man standing before him, a man who had lived with integrity, even in the face of hardship. The businessman's throat tightened as he realized the enormity of what was at stake. This wasn't just about a single night or a single mistake. This was about the kind of man he wanted to be from this point forward. The chauffeur stood patiently, his expression calm and unchanging. He wasn't there to force a decision or demand an apology. He had already forgiven the businessman, even if the businessman hadn't yet forgiven himself. The gesture of offering his hand was not about submission, but about reconciliation. It was a chance for the businessman to step away from the path of arrogance and toward a future shaped by humility. The room held its breath as the businessman looked down at the extended hand, knowing that the choice he made now would resonate far beyond this moment. The businessman's mind battled with itself, torn between two versions of his identity. On one hand, there was the man who had built an empire, who had always been in control, who saw weakness as failure. On the other, there was the man standing here now, stripped of his pretense, facing the consequences of his actions. He knew what the right choice was, but making it required him to confront everything he had feared: vulnerability, humility, and the possibility of change. The silence in the room grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were waiting for him to decide. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the businessman took a deep breath. His heart pounded in his chest as he lifted his hand, hesitating for just a moment before reaching out to grasp the chauffeur's. The tension broke as their hands connected, a symbolic gesture that spoke louder than any words could. In that moment, the businessman wasn't just accepting the chauffeur's forgiveness, he was accepting his own need to change. The room, once filled with judgment and anticipation, erupted into applause. But this time, the applause wasn't just for the chauffeur, it was for both of them. The businessman, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment, felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The applause echoed in his ears, but But it wasn't the sound that moved him. It was the realization that he had finally let go of the facade he had worn for so long. The chauffeur's hand in his felt steady, a grounding presence in the midst of his internal chaos. This was the moment of transformation, the point where everything shifted. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. The applause continued, but the real victory was the one within himself. The guests, witnessing the businessman's decision, felt a change in the air. What had started as a night of opulence and status had become something far more profound. They had come expecting a spectacle, but what they had witnessed was a moment of deep human connection, a rare and powerful glimpse into the transformative power of humility. The businessman's choice to take the chauffeur's hand wasn't just a personal victory. It was a reminder to everyone in the room that true strength lies not in wealth or power, but in the ability to change. The night had reached its climax, but the story was far from over. As the applause slowly died down, the businessman stood there, still holding the chauffeur's hand. The room, once so focused on wealth and appearance, had shifted its energy towards something deeper. This wasn't the end of the night. It was a new beginning. And as the businessman looked around at the faces of those who had once revered him for his success, he saw something different in their eyes. Respect, not for his wealth, but for his decision to change. The stage was set for what would come next, and the businessman knew that his journey was only just beginning. The room had shifted. The air that once buzzed with whispers of judgment and anticipation now carried a sense of calm. The businessman, who had spent the night grappling with his own ego and pride, stood in a state of quiet reflection. The applause had faded, but the significance of the moment lingered. He looked around at the guests, the opulent surroundings that had once defined his existence, and felt a profound change deep within. For the first time in years, his identity wasn't tied to the wealth he possessed, but to the humility he had finally embraced. As the night continued, the atmosphere of the party transformed entirely. Where there had once been a focus on luxury and status, there was now a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect. The guests, who had initially come to flaunt their wealth, found themselves engaged in conversations that felt more genuine, more grounded. The chauffeur, who had become the unexpected center of attention, was no longer seen as an outsider. His presence had altered the dynamics of the evening, turning what could have been a superficial gathering into something deeper, a shared understanding of what truly mattered. The businessman, now standing with a different posture, felt lighter. It was as if the weight of years of arrogance had finally lifted. He moved through the crowd, engaging with his guests in a way he had never done before. His conversations weren't laced with the usual arrogance or need for validation. Instead, he listened, truly listened, to the people around him. The change in him was palpable, and those who had known him for years could sense it. They no longer saw the cold, distant figure who had once dominated the room. Instead, they saw a man who had been humbled by his own mistakes and had emerged stronger because of it. The chauffeur, who had maintained his calm composure throughout the evening, observed the businessman's transformation with quiet satisfaction. He hadn't come to the party seeking attention or validation, but the events of the night had revealed something important to both men. The chauffeur had always known that life was about more than wealth and status, but now the businessman was beginning to understand that too. The bond between them, once defined by employer and servant, had shifted into something more profound, a shared recognition of humanity and the value of integrity. As the night wore on, the businessman found himself drawn back to the chauffeur. The man who had once been an afterthought in his life was now someone he deeply respected. They stood together, not as master and servant, but as equals, bound by the shared experience of the evening. The businessman, still feeling the weight of his actions, expressed his gratitude. He thanked the chauffeur, not just for his years of service, but for the lesson he had unknowingly imparted. The chauffeur, ever humble, nodded in acknowledgement, understanding that words weren't necessary to convey the depth of their newfound respect for one another. The guests, too, had been affected by the night's events. What had started as a celebration of wealth had turned into a reflection on character. Many of them, who had initially been caught up in the trappings of luxury, now found themselves contemplating their own lives. The businessman's transformation had inspired a shift in perspective for everyone in the room. It was a reminder that success wasn't measured by the things one owned, but by the strength of character one displayed in moments of vulnerability. The party, once a display of opulence, had become a space for genuine connection. As the evening drew to a close, the businessman knew that this was only the beginning of his personal transformation. The decisions he had made tonight were the first steps on a long journey toward becoming a better man. He understood now that the respect he craved couldn't be bought. It had to be earned through humility and integrity. The guests left the mansion with a sense of admiration, not for the lavish surroundings, but for the transformation they had witnessed. The businessman, once a symbol of arrogance, had become a beacon of change, and his journey was far from over. The chauffeur, having played his part in this transformation, prepared to leave. He had no desire to linger in the spotlight, content in the knowledge that his presence had sparked something important. As he made his way to the door, the businessman called out to him, asking him to stay a little longer. It wasn't a command, but a request, one that spoke to the shift in their relationship. The chauffeur, ever gracious, paused, turning to face the man who had once overlooked him. In that moment, there was no need for words. The businessman's expression said it all. He had changed, and he owed much of that to the chauffeur's quiet strength. As the guests slowly trickled out, the mansion's once vibrant energy settled into something more serene. The businessman stood by the door, watching them leave, a sense of peace washing over him. His transformation was still in its infancy, but it was real, and he knew that the choices he made from this point forward would be different. The chauffeur, having stayed a little longer at the businessman's request, finally prepared to depart. The two men shared a final look, a look of mutual respect and understanding. It was the end of the evening, but the beginning of something much more significant for both of them. As the businessman sat in the quiet of his mansion, long after the guests had departed, the weight of the evening's events settled upon him. The opulence that once defined his existence now felt hollow, stripped of its meaning. His mind replayed the moments of the night, but it wasn't the luxury or grandeur that lingered. It was the look in the chauffeur's eyes, the calm, unwavering strength of a man who had faced life's hardships with humility and grace. The businessman realized that, for all his wealth, he had missed the true essence of what it meant to be successful. The reflection came slowly at first, but it deepened with each passing moment. He had spent years accumulating riches, building an empire that he believed defined him. Yet, in one night, a single gesture, a handshake, had unraveled everything he thought he knew. The chauffeur had shown him something that no amount of money could buy: the value of integrity and the quiet power of humility. The businessman, for the first time in his life, understood that respect wasn't something that could be demanded or forced. It was earned through actions, through the way one treated others, regardless of their status. The businessman's gaze wandered around his lavish home, once a symbol of his power, now a reminder of how far he had strayed from what truly mattered. He had built walls around himself, insulating his life with wealth and arrogance, but those walls had crumbled. The chauffeur's presence, his humility, had been a mirror, reflecting the businessman's own shortcomings. It wasn't wealth that made a man strong, it was character. And in that moment, the businessman realized just how much he had to learn. The lesson wasn't about wealth or success. It was about humanity. As he sat there, the businessman knew that this was a turning point. He had spent years chasing the wrong things, but now, for the first time, he saw the path forward with clarity. The chauffeur, without ever seeking recognition, had taught him the most important lesson of his life. That real power came from humility, from the ability to see beyond oneself and recognize the worth in others. The businessman had spent years looking down on those he considered beneath him, but now, he understood that true greatness wasn't found in titles or status. It was found in how one treated others. The power of humility and respect wasn't just a lesson for the businessman. It was a transformation that would ripple through his life and beyond. The guests who had witnessed the events of the night would leave with their own reflections, having seen the shift in the businessman and the example set by the chauffeur. The businessman understood that this wasn't just a personal revelation. It was a call to live differently, to lead by example, and to ensure that his future actions were guided by the values he had ignored for so long. The journey ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face it. The businessman's thoughts returned to the chauffeur, the man who had unknowingly sparked this transformation. He knew he owed the chauffeur more than just gratitude. He owed him respect, not the kind of superficial respect born from wealth or power, but the deep, genuine respect that comes from recognizing the humanity in another person. The chauffeur's quiet dignity had been a beacon in the midst of the businessman's confusion, showing him the way forward. And now, the businessman understood that his life would never be the same. He had been given a second chance, and he wouldn't waste it. With this newfound clarity, the businessman knew that his journey of redemption was just beginning. He had taken the first steps toward becoming the man he should have been all along, but there was still much to be done. The choices he made moving forward would define not just his legacy, but the person he would become. The mansion, once filled with reminders of his success, now seemed like a blank slate, a place where he could start anew, with humility and respect at the core of his actions. He would build something better, something rooted in the values he had finally come to understand. The lesson of the night echoed in his mind. Humility and respect are not weaknesses, but strengths. They are the foundation upon which true success is built. The businessman knew he had to carry this lesson with him, not just in his professional life, but in every aspect of his existence. He would strive to treat those around him with the same respect that the chauffeur had shown him, recognizing the humanity in each person he encountered. It wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to change. The chauffeur's example had given him the courage to face his flaws and the strength to grow. The night had been transformative, but the real work was just beginning. The businessman had been given a gift, a chance to reshape his life, to become the person he had always wanted to be but had been too blinded by pride to see. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond wealth or power. He would walk this path with humility, knowing that the journey itself was the reward. And as he stood up from his chair, ready to face whatever came next, he knew that his life would never be the same again. What a journey this has been. But you know what? This is just the beginning. Right now, another story is waiting for you. The one that will take you even deeper into unexpected twists and revelations. What happens next is beyond anything you can imagine. Click on the next video that's appearing on your screen now, and get ready to be pulled into a new adventure filled with emotions, surprises, and unforgettable moments. And don't forget, if you've enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on the next one. These are the stories that touch your heart, stir your soul, and leave you wanting more. We want to hear from you too. Leave a comment and tell us what you thought of this story. Your insights and emotions matter to us.